Welcome to Mighty Banyans on the Bay, the faculty podcast of New College of Florida. My name is Douglas Estes, and I'm the Associate Professor of Religion here at New College.
And I'm Bruce Gilley. I'm the Presidential Scholar in Residence here at the New College, and we are very pleased to have with us today Dr. Bruce Abramson, who is Executive Director of New Student and Graduate Recruitment here at the New College, and a sometime lecturer and author and man of many skills. Welcome to the podcast, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
We usually start out and try and get to know our guests a little bit, their journey, their career, their education, and everything. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So if I were writing a book about my career, which is not this book, it would be called Don't Let This Happen to You. Okay? It's a cautionary tale. I started out my PhD is in computer science. I was an AI researcher in the 1980s. And at the time, I thought that most of the famous people in AI were looking in the wrong place. I insisted that artificial intelligence had to be about large-scale data mining, statistical analysis, probabilistic reasoning, and talking to experts to get information from them. That was not where the field wanted to go. If anybody knows anything about academic politics, telling the famous people in your field that they're wrong is not a good career move. But I did end up building a couple of very interesting decision models, largely in conjunction with economists. I did a lot of work with cognitive psychologists and behavioral economists, and I loved some of the economic modeling that I was doing. So I taught myself enough economics to somehow emerge as the data guy doing antitrust modeling and damages analysis. And I went and did that for a number of consulting firms who were working primarily in regulatory analysis and litigation analysis. And once I started doing that, I figured I might as well work my way through law school. So I picked up a law degree, and I spent a year clerking for a federal judge, and I went around looking for a job. I was in Washington at the time, and I knocked on the door of all the law firms and all the consulting firms and all the think tanks and all the government agencies, and they looked at my resume and said, "Very impressive. What do you do? We can't figure it out." And everybody I spoke to said, "We can't really figure out how to slot you into our organization, but we have a really hard problem we'd like you to take a look at." And after several months of being very unhappy with those responses, I realized there was a business model in there. So I figured I'll hang out my own shingle, I'll start my own consulting practice, I'll solve interesting, hard problems for people. And after 6 months or so, somebody will say, "Why don't we turn this into a full-time job?" 20 years later, I was still at it when COVID came. And one of the things, actually, I guess that was 15 years later, I was at it when COVID came. And one of the things that I learned is that it doesn't matter what your credentials are, it doesn't matter what you bill by the hour, it doesn't matter what you can do. If you're out hustling up every new project, you're basically a glorified Uber driver. And when you read at the beginning of COVID that they killed the gig economy, I was the high end of the gig economy. And it destroyed my business, which meant that I got to sit around and think about where I wanted to go from here. One of the ideas that came to me was that I'd never left academia happily. I'd been a professor. I left in 1993, and my impression at that point was that higher education in America was a hollow shell that didn't do anything particularly well, and it was just a matter of time before enough people noticed to launch a reform movement. Well, about 25 years later, in 2018, I thought people were starting to pay attention, and I went back and I wrote what I'd wanted to write since '93. Shortly after my previous book came out, talking about the corruption of higher education, it's called The New Civil War, I read a story in a newspaper in January of '23 about how Governor DeSantis had changed the board of New College of Florida, and this was basically going to use it to lead a movement for education reform in this country. And I took one look at that story and I said, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to say they're going to fix higher education. I'll be damned if I'm going to let them do it without me. And I hit my phones and I hit my network, and I had to find a way to come to campus to be part of what I think is one of the most exciting experiments underway in America today.
What a journey.
Yeah, great. So tell us a little bit about your academic area in general, as far as like you're sometime lecturer here. What are some of the classes that you would teach?
Right now, in fact, starting shortly after this broadcast, I'm teaching a course called Information Integrity. Now, information integrity, and I should say, much as I might say, don't let this happen to you, one of the great upsides of having your own consulting practice and doing oddball projects is that if you do it right, you have a lot of time to research and write about whatever interests you. So I have had the luxury that really many lifelong academics lack, and then I've been able to write about a variety of different topics. And one of the things I say is, I find something that interests me, I buy 20 books, I read 10, I write one, and then I feel like I've learned something. The information integrity course came about because about the time I heard about New College being reformed, I said to myself, suppose I got back into the classroom. What's the most valuable thing I could teach today's college students? And the answer I came up with was the skills that they need to navigate today's information and media terrain safely. I'm a big believer. A couple of my books talk about living during the transition from late industrial to early information age. And I really believe we are early in the information age. Now, if you think about that, I can talk to some of our anthropology colleagues, I'm sure they'll confirm. The Stone Age was called the Stone Age because we learned how to make tools and weapons out of stone. The Iron Age was called the Iron Age because we learned how to make tools and weapons out of iron. In the information age, our primary tools and our primary weapons are informational. And if you are a college student today, you have been playing with power tools and you have been in the crosshairs of deadly weapons since you were a toddler, and you certainly didn't understand this when you started. Chances are fairly good you don't know it now. So this is the course I'm teaching this semester. The concepts are drawn largely from cognitive psychology, from network flow theory, and from Bayesian analysis. We'll talk about the tricks of playing to manipulate you online, the skills you need to reason from evidence and ask the right questions, and the network flow understanding to see how information flows through a network. So that's this semester's course. Still not what this book is about.
But I see, before we get to the book,
Yeah.
which I want to talk about, but I see, Bruce, there's a very interesting, almost serendipitous connection between your work in information and related, network organizational challenges of modern society, and being the person who's recruiting our students and talking to our students about the world that they should be preparing themselves for, because clearly your view is we need to be preparing our students for this information age to come. And as admissions director, you get to talk to them, you need to scout them, recruit them. That just seems like completely serendipitous, but it seems to me there's a clear connection between your role in the classroom and as a scholar and your role on the administration here.
Yeah, there's absolutely a connection. One of the things that I have found most intriguing as I've been recruiting and as I've been talking to high school students is, again, this doesn't come as a surprise to me because this is a lot of what I do in the course, is that nobody has ever taught them about follow-up questions. So a fairly common answer I'll be at a college fair and I'll speak to some high school students and I'll say to them, what are you interested in studying? And they'll say, well, I'd like to study business. And I'll say, great, what do you think it means to study business? And they're all taken aback. They all say to me, that's not the question I was expecting. No one's ever asked me that before. And it's not just the business students. I get that from students who say they want to be pre-meds. They had never thought about what that meant in terms of selecting college courses or selecting a major, other than, you probably had to take some sciencey stuff along the way. I get that from most students. The art of the follow-up question is lost. People don't seem to know how to dive deep. They have a goal in mind, but they don't really know how to get there. And these are all critical informational skills. So it absolutely does tie into, recruiting, and it ties into, one of the things that I try when I go to college fairs is I try to find a way to engage with any of the applicants in whatever interests them. It doesn't matter what interests me. If they happen to raise a field that I know something about, that's a great topic of conversation. If they don't, then I ask them the follow-up questions to find out what they think this means and what interests them. And these are skills that you really do need to navigate today. And this, by the way, these are the critical thinking skills at the heart of a liberal arts curriculum.
Yeah, very good. So let's turn to your book for just
Sure.
a second. And title is American Spirit or Great Awakening.
Awakening.
Awakening. Sorry.
Subtitled The
O.
Battle to Restore or Destroy Our Nation.
Yes. Tell us a little bit about your book.
Sure. So this book actually did not start as a professional or scholarly inquiry. It started with two sets of observations. The first was I was sort of, I kind of liked the American politics of the 1990s. I thought that we had two political parties. Anybody who remembers or has studied the 1990s knows Bill Clinton was president. Through the middle of the decade, Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House. These were two very smart, very charismatic people who had passion and vision for the future. And everything that happened that decade, all the good stuff that happened, meant that they both signed off on it. And they brought with them the middle 70-80% of the American public. Those were good politics. After the year 2000, things began to diverge and polarize. And I didn't like the polarization that I was seeing. And having been a good Clinton Democrat in the 90s, I really didn't like the direction that the left was going. So that was in the background. The thing that really motivated this book was the second prong of my observations. And that is that when Facebook first came out, I was very active on Facebook. And I was connected to, I don't know, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 people, most of whom I had known at some point in my life. Not all, but many of them were friends of friends, but most of them were people I'd known, and a lot of them were people I'd cared about very deeply. Somewhere between about 2013 and 2017, I started getting very distressed because I was seeing more and more people I'd known, I'd thought highly of, I'd cared for, I'd loved, spouting garbage. They were saying things that I considered blatantly racist. They were talking about, they were promoting child abuse, and I couldn't understand it. At one point, the wife of a friend, the guy I knew, had been a PhD physicist. His wife was a PhD in gender studies, and I'd said something extolling Martin Luther King and the vision of blindness, vision of color blindness.
Oh, Bruce.
Around MLK Day, and she wrote to me a very long and lovely note explaining that what I was talking about was older forms of racism, but in her terms, recent scientific discoveries have uncovered completely new forms of racism that are even more dangerous and damaging. And once I saw that, I began to see things through a different lens, and I realized that there was an entirely different, not just a worldview, which I was used to, there was an entirely different value set that was bubbling up. And it was bubbling up most clearly among my people, among what I call America's credentialed, affluent professional elites. And I really needed to understand it. And that sent me on a long journey trying to understand what was going on. So it was really, and I had to get off Facebook, by the way. I got off Facebook in late 2017, and I joined Twitter, which was much better, because on Twitter, I was largely connected to strangers, and learning that the world is full of idiots and bigots doesn't really bother me. I kind of knew that already. At least I don't think less of people I care about.
So the book essentially makes 3 points, and those are the 3 parts of the book. The first talks about a spiritual crisis in the United States, which we might think was, visible with the rise of the new atheism, the decline of church attendance, of synagogue attendance, of temple attendance. So there's that. The second part is this analysis of wokeism, reified identity politics, as James Lindsay would call it, and associated fanaticisms as not just a political project, but as you're arguing here, as a spiritual project to fill that in. And then the third part is the call for a return to traditional American spiritualism in all its manifold forms as the remedy to wokeism, as opposed to a kind of Peter Boghossian approach of we just need to clear the whole public square of all forms of faith and belief, and we'll all be better off. So that's my That's my summary. Can you walk us through those parts?
Sure. So one of the things I talk about, I think in the second chapter, is I talk about my personal journey because it's relevant to what I think the country is going to. So I was raised in a religious environment, modern Orthodox Judaism, if that means anything to anyone. But basically, I was raised in two worlds and two cultures. And we were Shabbat observant, and we kept strictly kosher, as did my entire community. And I wasn't impressed. I wasn't impressed. I had a lot of qualms when I was in college. As I say, there were three big qualms. One was I just didn't see how all this religious involvement made the people I knew better than other people. Two was I had a lot of philosophical difficulties. Being an intellectual, the philosophical difficulties really matter.
As you do as a college student, right?
Yes.
Isn't it kind
Yes.
of more or less the definition of being a college student?
Right. And three is utilitarian. There were good parties on Friday nights that I wanted to go to, and this stuff was getting in my way. And so I walked away, and I made a call that has been going on for decades, if not centuries. I kind of figured I really don't need a spiritual side, right? I don't need this stuff. I'm a thinker. I live in the world of reason. I don't need it. And I walked away, but I always remained engaged within the community and within the philosophical discussion. In fact, my father was a college professor, but he was also a rabbi and a Talmudic scholar. And the safe space for us is where everybody else finds danger. When my father and I were having fun, we were debating theology and religious philosophy and politics and current events. That's how you knew we were getting along. So I spent a long time wandering, and I got to know a lot of other traditions through time, and I got to meet a lot of people who were looking for meaning, and I began to observe that everywhere I went, I found people who were looking for meaning. And at one point, I sort of said, well, traditionally, people find meaning in God, in family, in country, and we've kind of devalued all of those. But what really hit home was about, 15 to 20 years ago. I was living in San Francisco, and I made a whole bunch of friends, and I worked my way into some of San Francisco's alternative communities. And there's a whole scene, and there are a lot of different communities. And one of the things that struck me was that not only had these communities recreated a lot of the things I'd seen growing up in mirror image, warped form, perverse form, or, if you prefer, superior form, but there were clearly parallels. And what was even more interesting to me was that I spoke to people about what they resented most from their own childhood. It was precisely where they had gravitated. So the folks who would tell me that they grew up in communities that spoke in tongues or had snake handling at their services were the ones, I'd say to them, okay, well, I get that. Would you like to grab dinner on Tuesday? And they'd say, no, Tuesday night I have to go ecstatic dancing in a moonlit grove in Marin. And I'd say, do you not understand that speaking in tongues and ecstatic dancing are the same thing? They'd swear they had nothing to do with each other. I knew a guy who told me that I went hiking, and my hiking guide, I asked my hiking guide how he liked living out in the middle of nowhere. We were in Utah. And he said to me, I like it very much. People out here are nice enough. I came out here because it's nature's beauty. But problem with the people here, I got two big issues. One is they all believe in the rapture. Two is they don't believe in global warming. And I said to him, do you not understand that these are the same story? And he said, no, they have nothing to do with each other. I said, come on. Man is living out of harmony with nature. And if he does not radically alter his lifestyle and avert from his profligate ways, the earth, seas, and skies will rise up to smite him down. Okay? This is the Armageddon story. This is the story that comes through one area after another. And as the years went by, I began to see, one of the things that I look at in this book is I've seen other people who talk about how people treat politics as if it were a religion. I'm saying something different. I believe that there are deep human questions to which we need answers. We all need answers. And one of the parallels I say spirituality, I've concluded, is a deep human need. Now, it's not, I'm clear about this, it's not a need like food or water or sleep, where if you don't have it, you'll die. You can go through life without spirituality. It is a need like sex. You have a sex drive, you enjoy it. Plenty of people have led very fulfilling celibate lives. And I believe that plenty of people can lead very fulfilling aspiritual lives. But there's something missing. It's not for everybody. It's really hard. And there is a point in your life when you need it, okay? When you're, at the funeral of a loved one and you tearfully say to someone, I can't believe grandma's not here. They would never say to you, what are you talking about? She's the old lady in a box in the front of the room. Mm-hmm. Right. Without connecting to the spirit, that answer is completely correct. Mm-hmm. So there are questions like, where were my children before I met their other parent? What happened to my loved ones after they left? There are a whole range of these. And I show how planks of the woke agenda address these spiritual needs, these metaphysical needs, using only language that resonates with today's credential elite.
Yeah. It's interesting because it seems like to me that with your analogy of the funeral, that the idea that grandma is just the corpse in the box is the materialist view. And yet there are many people who advocate and embrace the materialist view, and yet they would never say that because they don't fully commit to it, which is why, in the first half of your book, the spiritual crisis is exactly what we're facing. I think that in every generation, you could argue there's a spiritual crisis, not to take away from the challenges of today. But what is the antidote? Because, and I want to make one more segue, because I still struggle with friends, colleagues who do not see that they are engaging in religion, but it's the religion of politics, it's the religion of our society today, but they don't see it in any way as being religious, and yet it's clearly religious. How do we get out from this crisis?
Okay, so there are two questions there,
yeah.
And they're connected. The way that we get out, I think, is to reconnect with core American spirituality. I believe, and this is again going back to my techie roots, okay? I believe that when Jefferson led the committee writing the Declaration of Independence, he came up with something absolutely brilliant. And it was absolutely necessary because of the extent to which different, mostly Christian, mostly Protestant, some Catholic denominations were intertwined in the colonies. And that is what he built was an entirely new approach to religion. Not an entirely new religion, but an entirely new approach to religion. And what he did was, he said, we're going to have this baseline core ethical system that is derived from biblical ethics. Many people don't know that in addition to the Declaration of Independence, one of the books that Thomas Jefferson wrote is called the Jefferson Bible. And what he did was, he went into the Gospels and he crossed out all the miracles. And he was left with, I believe the subheading is, The Life and Teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And his idea was, even if you reject or are apathetic to the divinity of Christ, the teachings of Jesus still came to a core set of morals that are critical for society. Now, as a techie, I look at this and I say, okay, what Jefferson did was he built a platform. He said there is a core of biblical ethics that is the spiritual platform of America. Then he exposed a bunch of APIs. And he said, any denomination of any faith that you can make connect to our APIs.
APIs?
APIs are application programming interfaces. This is how they are, if you've ever written or if you've ever used an app. The way that an app developer connects to a platform, an operating system, is basically through a handshake. It's a jigsaw puzzle. You have to fit the pieces of your application on top of the platform. And that's what Jefferson did. And by the way, it doesn't mean that the idea that anything goes in America. There have been polygamous groups that came to America and had to jettison those. I have plenty of Hindu American friends who believe that Americanism is completely compatible with Hinduism. They had to get rid of the caste system. Okay? The American view of religion, this notion of there being a core spiritual platform that you can complete in multiple ways, is radical, and it was an innovation in the 18th century.
And I think there's interesting studies of how the Catholics became more democratic in the American setting than they had been in any other setting. Part of the same idea of, as Americans, something happens in the United States to all faiths that transforms them into something that's A, both coherent, and B, linked to common sets of moral claims, and just seems to work better, for lack of a better phrase.
That's not only completely true, but that should be obvious. Okay, no faith, Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, look different in their American incarnations than they do elsewhere. Islam is struggling with it. Okay, this is one of the big challenges going through American Islam, is how to develop an American version of Islam, or a fully American compatible version of Islam. It's not always easy, and it's not fair. Okay, let's be clear. The closer you start to biblical roots, the easier it is for you to map onto the core biblical ethics. Mm-hmm. Okay, if anybody thought that this was fair, it's not. But they're all out there. And there are at least versions of every faith that we've tried that can be made fully American compatible.
Yeah. It's interesting because there is a counter argument here, which is that myself as a biblical scholar, there's an element of Jefferson's work that I'm not crazy about, because he does, jettison the miracles, which is a reaction to what was going on in Europe with higher criticism at the time. And so it's almost like Jefferson did something brilliant, but the problem with the brilliance is that it still left a back door for other ideologies to kind of sneak in. So how do we maintain a good Jeffersonian approach, but without other ideologies being smuggled in the back door, which is kind of what we see today?
Yeah, okay, let's.
So in other words, wokeism was an example of something that snuck in the back door.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And partly is because, to me, it hides itself within the cloak of Judeo-Christian ideas. But it it doesn't seem very Judeo-Christian a lot of the times.
No, it's actually not. And in fact, I talk about how wokeism comes from a utopian tradition. And I see utopianism, which was a movement that really got picked up steam in the early 19th century. So after the American Revolution, and after the Declaration, and after the Constitution, the most prominent example of utopian society is Marxism. But basically, utopianism rejects the fall. The most basic story in the Bible is the fall of man. It's the first story after creation. And the biblical tradition, all versions of it, rest upon the idea that humanity is flawed and fallible, and perfection is achievable only for the divine. Utopianism rejects it. Utopianism says the reason the world is so messed up is that we have exploitative societal structures.
Oppression, right?
Yeah, oppression, exploitation. And if we could correct society, if we could remove the oppression from society, human nature would follow the lead and evolve to achieve a state of perfection. It is a radically different value system.
If I could only mutilate my body a few more times and have more acceptance in every way, things would work out great.
Well, I want to go back to your other question about how to talk to people.
Great. I love it.
This relates to another concept I talk about. One of the other things that motivated me to write this book is that I believe that wokeism is a religion, and it is obviously, until 2 weeks ago, it was everywhere. And it was coming into the public schools, it was coming into higher education. I believe there is a move to turn it into the established religion of the United States. That raises, from a legal perspective, a question that has never before been addressed. There has never been a challenge where somebody said, you're violating the Establishment Clause by sticking your religion into a public forum and imposing it on me. And the response has been, we're not a religion. The courts have never had to define what is a religion because that's never been an issue before.
Right.
Now, when we talk about a contemporary religion and why it doesn't look or sound like anything else, okay? There's an interesting point here. Every existing faith, everyone, Christianity, Judaism, Shinto, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, paganism, Baal worship, Moloch worship, they all had one thing in common. They all arose in a pre-modern society. Okay? The people who got the message, and certainly the generations through which it had to be broadcast, were shepherds and farmers, maybe merchants, maybe seafarers. And so all existing religions make heavy use of pastoral metaphors. Okay? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The guy who wrote that, King David, was a shepherd. Okay? He was raised in a shepherd, in a family of shepherds, in a community of shepherds. When he writes, the Lord is my shepherd, that's not just a metaphor, that's not just poetry. That is deeply personal. If you walk into a room today in the Bay Area, in Hollywood, in Washington, D.C., in New York City, all of which I've called home, and you say, the Lord is my shepherd, I guarantee there aren't a lot of shepherds sitting in the audience. They're investment bankers, they're neurosurgeons, they're movie directors. This doesn't mean anything to them. If you were developing a religion in the modern world, you would not cast it in pastoral metaphors. It just wouldn't sound the same. You would say things like, follow the science. Right? I mean, you would put everything dealing with the human body into medical terms. One of the biggest issues that I come up with is actually look at the trans movement. Right? Now, the interesting thing about the trans movement, okay, and I say this is deep metaphysics. Why? The basis of the entire trans movement is the idea that I might be trapped in the wrong body. Okay? I might have been born into the wrong body. Well, first of all, just to say that, there's an I, there's me, that is separate from the body. Second of all, whatever it is, we can't test for it, we can't observe it. It's not genetic, it's not endocrinological, it's not physiological, it's in there somewhere. Okay? The trans movement, to exist, has to have a concept of an inner essence of who I am that is truer than what you might think by looking at my body.
So in other words, a spiritual claim of some sort.
It's a spiritual claim, but it's also what every other tradition calls the soul.
Right.
Now, you don't have to call it a soul if you don't want to. Okay? But to be woke, to believe in the trans movement, to say that it's possible for somebody to be caught, to be trapped in the wrong body, you must believe that there is a me separate from and truer than the physical realm.
Right. Now, we can go on in these. We should bring this back a little bit in our last minutes to your work at New College. So I see a tremendous, as I say, a resonance and a serendipity between what you've worked on in your career in this book and what the New College transformation is about, which is to, restore a sense of a public square that hasn't been taken over by any movement of any sort. And I do think that's the project here. And I think as you're growing out and you're selling the college, bring this back again to how you're recruiting students, what students who are considering New College should think about. Is this the place for them? If they're interested, what are the next steps?
Right. So this book and my class are about the art of asking questions. That's what we do here. We ask questions. If you can sit around, if you can withstand follow-up questions, if you can express your views respectfully and thoughtfully and take follow-up questions, I want you here. These are the speakers we want. These are the students we want. As far as I'm concerned, okay, the difference between ideological indoctrination and open intellectual discourse is if you are prepared to stand up and say, some people believe that, and you can put yourself forward as one of those people if you wish, and that's fine. And you are prepared to end with, and now I will take any question that can be phrased respectfully, I want you on my campus. These are the students we want, this is the faculty we want, these are the guest speakers we want. Okay? And this is the difference, if you think about it, in a public school. It's the difference between saying, Jesus died for your sins, and saying Christians believe that Jesus died for your sins. Okay? The former would be indoctrination. The latter is a critical part of education for anybody living in Western society or the modern world, or quite frankly, inhabiting a planet in which about 20% of the people are Christian. And the same is true for all other faiths. So these are things that I think we need. New College must become, America must become a place that asks questions.
Great. Well, it's great to have Dr. Bruce Abramson here with us today to talk about his new book and the spiritual crisis in America.
And as we always finish, we go Mighty Banyans at the end. Bruce, you ready?
Yep.
So, thanks for joining. We'll see you next time. And until then,
Go Mighty Banyans!